Welcome to today's session, everyone. We're starting very shortly. This is Stretching the Future by Design, and I'll be having a conversation with Christian Bason. Should just remind everyone as well, if anyone has any questions during the session, please use the chat function. Welcome everyone, it's so nice to see you. Okay, well, as everyone comes in, let's begin, and people can join as we start. You can see this is Stretching the Future by Design with Christian Bason. So before we start, I should just introduce myself and what we're doing here in this conversation. So for those of you who don't know, my name is Louise Pulford. I'm the CEO of Six. We're based in London, Social Innovation Exchange. We're a global organization helping organizations be better prepared for some of the challenges that face us ahead, which is exactly what Christian's book is about doing. I've known Christian ever since we begun Six, I think, probably for over a decade now. So it's a real privilege to be able to talk to you today. And we're hosting these series of conversations as part of a series called Reshaping Europe, which is part of a European Commission funded program where we're setting up competence centres, social innovation competence centres across all EU member states. And the purpose of this conversation and this series of conversations which we're having is to help people expand their thinking, which again is another reason why it's fantastic that we're talking with Christian today. The other conversations that we've had will be on the website. We can share links for them afterwards, and you'll be able to listen to this one afterwards if you've not been able to attend in person. But for now, Christian, thank you so much for coming in and talking to everyone and being part of this conversation.
Pleasure to being here.
So nice to see you. Most people on this call will know you very, very well. But would you like to just introduce yourself in your own words?
Sure. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining over the lunch break or whatever it is in your time zone. So my name is Christian Bason, CEO of the Danish Design Center. I've been engaged in, you could say, innovation and change for society for quite a long time. First as a consultant, then for 8 years as director of MindLab, which was the Danish government's internal innovation team. And then the last 8 years as CEO of the Danish Design Center, which has actually been around for over 40 years as an institution advancing the value of design for both business and society. And today it certainly also has to do with the planet. And yeah, I wrote a new book with my good friend Jens Martin Skibsted. So that's there we go. That's a good shot. And so that's of course what I'm really thrilled to be talking about. And it's a book that resonates with the work we're doing in the DDC, but it also of course is some thinking in its own right.
Absolutely. So thank you, Christian. We really appreciate your time. Now, I'll just remind the participants that if you have questions, please do put them in the chat. I will try and incorporate them as we go, but there will also be time at the end for those kind of questions. Okay, so first, the book. Let's talk about why you wrote the book. Now, you're a busy man, you run an organization, you've got a life. Writing a book is requires quite a lot of energy. So there must have been a real kind of need that you saw that meant that you needed to focus your energy in this way. So yeah, why did you write it, and why now?
Yeah, so in the book there's a quote by the American designer Charles Eames that in a way was the at least philosophical starting point, but maybe also practical starting point, which was that he once was interviewed by a journalist in France for a French magazine, and actually the interview with Eames is online in his legacy website, so you can still read it. And in the interview, he does a very, very good job, I think, of explaining, and this is in the 1970s, right? But explaining what is design. And at one point, this journalist gets a little bit confused because she starts understanding that design is essentially everything. And she goes, but what are then the boundaries of design? And slightly rudely, Charles Eames answers with another question. He says, what are the boundaries of problems? And that was the starting point for the book, in the sense that Jens Martin and I, we recognized through our own careers and work, he's an industrial designer. He's actually also a design philosopher. He's a partner in an agency here in Denmark, a global agency called ManyOne. And I've have had my career with consulting, but then with MindLab and design for policy and the DDC, a sort of design for sustainable innovation and growth. And we both could see the need to make a contribution to the thinking in design, because as the problems we're facing in the world are certainly expanding and accelerating and becoming sort of multiplying. I think that's what's happened in this year, certainly. The field of design needs to keep up with the problems. It needs to actually be ahead of the problems, right? So we need to have a profession it's a profession of innovation, right? It's a profession that's focusing on change, that's focusing on making, on creation, on creativity. And if that profession is not reflective and up to speed with the challenges we face as people, as societies, as business, but also as humanity, then we're in trouble, right? So we wanted to get us out of the trouble that we've made for ourselves in a way, around the challenges we see. And so that's the book. And I have to say also that when we started talking about it, we were like, let's write the book about design, like the one and only. That's probably a bit too much to claim, but we are wanting to point towards the future of design and how we need to think about design to address the challenges we face.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you. And then we will come back to the environment a little bit as we go through. But maybe could you just say something a little bit about the concept of human-centered design, because you just alluded to these are the problems that we've made.
Yeah.
And I think at some points you talk about moving from human-centered design to is it life-centered design? Or?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that and how that's important.
Right. So in a way, design is an incredible success as a profession, as a discipline, right? So partnering with the growth of industrial society, mass production, and so designers partnering with industry, with business, with management, and partnering with, not least, with marketing. The profession has simply become very, very good at creating attractive products and services that are so attractive and so desirable that we've wanted to buy a lot of them. And so we've purchased and consumed and bought so much stuff based on a model of production that takes materials out of the earth, modifies the material, makes it into desirable products. We consume them and then we throw them away. And that goes for everything we do as humanity, right? That we've almost destroyed the planet. So far, the only home we have. And we've, in a way, done it by design, actually to the point that geologists are now calling the age we live in the Anthropocene, which means the age of man, because the planet is now more man-made than it's natural in its original sense, at least. I mean, we are also nature, but we're making it artificial. And so it's an incredible success that's gotten us to a point where we are almost, making ourselves extinct. And so now the challenge is how to design in a different way that is truly sustainable.
That's amazing. Thank you. And then linked to that, I guess the question I have is, who is this book for? Because again, I've heard you talk about it being not for designers specifically. And so if we need to do this kind of amazing reconfiguring the way we're thinking about design and what we create and who we create it for and with, etc. Who should be reading this?
So in short, it's for the informed citizen, or the enlightened citizen, in the sense that it's for anyone who cares about the future, and anyone who is interested in professionally or perhaps even privately, changing or recognizing the changes we need to make. Now, that being said, there's also some rich material in there for designers, because there's also an inherent critique in where design is right now. Yeah. And so there's a critique, of course, in a way, of the profession, and not least of design thinking as a model of a methodology, you might say. There's also lots in there for policymakers who are in a key position to influence some of these developments, right? There's definitely a lot in there for the business leaders and innovators, or leaders of organizations generally. So in a way, that's of course the strength and a weakness maybe, but it's a book for anyone who cares about the future in the different roles they take. And so that way, it's actually a very broad book, and it's also written in a language and written in a way that, I'm not saying it's always easy language, but it's written with so many examples and so many exemplifications of what we're talking about, that I think it's actually accessible for most people.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. And your stories that are throughout, I can see, and the tools at the end, the kind of useful summary of some of the methods and how you can use this, which we'll get into. That really resonates for me, that you can be using your book and some of the lessons in so many different ways.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's get into this. We can't avoid the fact that you are Danish, that you are based in Denmark. You co-authored this book with your Danish colleague. And you have a little section at the beginning called Getting to Denmark.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you the question about how Denmark got to Denmark, mainly because many of the people listening who listen to these talks are coming from the European competence centers. And I cannot tell you a meeting that I have not been to when someone says, oh, if we could just do it like Denmark. How do you do it in that way? And so I know this is not the point of your book, but I think for the audience who are listening here, just having a little moment about Denmark would be helpful. And I interviewed Uffe Elbæk a couple of months ago, and we have a podcast episode up with him where he's talking about the culture and the kind of historical background of what kind of made Denmark get to Denmark. But could you tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, and why that's important in the book?
Yeah, and I should say that we have this section on getting to Denmark because we think it illustrates a wider point about what you can achieve by design.
Right.
And I should also say that both Jens Martin and I have grown up in families or in lives that are very international and global. Jens Martin, part of a family that's also very active in industry and actively global. And my last name is because of my dad, who's from the United States. I'm a dual citizen. I've spent a lot of time in my life in the US. So both he and I are seeing Denmark, of course, from the inside, but we've also seen Denmark from the outside. And we also have the same experience as you, that often, Denmark would be highlighted, like famously the Francis Fukuyama book chapter or paper on with the title Getting to Denmark. That, there's something about this particular society, which is of course a small society. It is somewhat homogeneous still, that's unique, and the question is, what makes it unique, and what's made Denmark what Denmark is today? And we are arguing that in many ways, you can see a society as a result of millions of design decisions, millions of decisions about what to create or what not to create. And Denmark's history or legacy has been in a way that we have come from being, a relatively poor agricultural country, used to be very long time ago a small empire, lost pretty much everything, and not least 1864 to our big neighbor to the south, and we lost some things to Sweden and so on. So there's really just a very small homogeneous country left. But then through, I would say, essentially social innovation, we've been able to transform the society not only into a very efficient and by the way, democratically governed agricultural society, but also an industrial society that very early on embraced, if not socialism, then at least social democracy, meaning that workers ultimately got rights and conditions that were fair and over time, of course, got better and better, and a model of and negotiated settlements around how we want to organize society. So both, agricultural organization, which was around co-ownership and cooperatives as the main thing, which it still is to the very day today. ALA, the company, is a cooperative. The way you structure co-op, of course, the company, as some countries is a cooperative. And so, in a way, through social innovation and through enlightenment, also investing in education for disadvantaged youth and for the rural population, you suddenly have a society that's actually become quite strong, quite socially cohesive, a society that becomes able to solve problems democratically. We have an organization. We have a saying in Denmark that if two Danes meet, they start an organization. They start a association, which means that we are probably the country in the world with the highest number of non-governmental organizations or associations in sports and culture and so on per capita. So we are, in a way, we create an infrastructure that's allowed the country to develop. And then in the 1980s and 90s, we realized that there was something called computers and IT and data and digital, and embracing very quickly the knowledge society, famously that the Danish tax office have used computers for taxation since the 1970s, and already in the 80s, our tax returns became more and more digital. And I haven't looked thoroughly at my tax return for several decades because it's done digitally, and it's very simple, the updates you need to make. So we've created a society that somehow continuously addresses problems. It does it through deliberation and public debate. It does it through tripartite agreements. It does it through the organizations we've created. So in many ways, you could say that's all by design. And then, of course, the final layer, which you'll recognize if you fly into Copenhagen, is that since the 1950s, especially 40s, 50s, we've actually had a design community that supported that whole growth of the welfare state through the aesthetics and the giving a form to architecture and to furniture and to interiors and to spaces. So you'll recognize that Danish design in terms of those products much of it is very timeless. Much of it is very clean and simple and accessible. Even we would call it democratic. It's made with a social purpose in many ways. For example, getting light into rooms, into homes. The company called Velux that creates skylights, as the world leading in skylights. They frame it as giving quality of life to people through light. So you have this purpose-driven design in many ways that, of course, is also today quite expensive, some of it, and elite, but it actually came from a different place. A place that also connected beautiful aesthetics and modernism on the one side with great craftsmanship on the other side. So all these things together means that we now have a society that's consistently rated among the top 3 happiest on the planet. Over time, it's a society where Copenhagen, which I'm looking at right now, is most livable city on the planet, or at least top 3 or 5. And a society where there are still lots of problems to solve, lots of challenges, and nothing's perfect by any means. But it's a society where also, here in the city, 60% of the population commutes by bicycle to work, which is, except for a few places in Holland, I think, in Netherlands, I think it's unique. So I think what we're trying to say is that this doesn't come out of anything. It comes out of lots and lots of decisions being made over time. And if we can learn from how good design decisions are made, we can make our own future in whatever society we are in. So we are not wanting anyone physically necessarily to go here or to become like Denmark, but we're saying that there's a lesson to be learned from the operating system that we run on, which is driven by design.
I think that's really helpful for lots of us in other countries as well, just to always look back and just kind of understand the decisions that have been made to get to where we've got to, right, or the kind of work that's put in to get to where we've got to, that we can't just kind of carbon copy someone else's society and ours and copy what we think on the surface feels right, because there are so many other dynamics, not to mention, being a smaller country or a bigger country. Absolutely. Makes a big difference as well to these things as well. And I think, the more that we can try and learn from countries that are more similar to us and that have made more decisions like us, the easier our kind of transnational learning will be. So I think it's a really important point. And as you say, you're coming this not just from a Danish perspective, but from an outside too.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get into the book a little bit. So your book is the kind of core of the book is based on these kind of 6 expansions. I kind of think of them as tools or just frames to help you think. This is how I interpreted it.
Mm-hmm.
You could have had many. So maybe I'll ask you first, which is your favorite? Do you have a favorite? And then I'm interested, is there anything that you left out that you almost used as an expansion? And maybe as well, just talk us through all of them in whichever order you would like to.
Right.
Obviously,
I
everyone's
remember
going to
the
read
order.
the book.
It's always having 6 is always a little bit tricky because it's almost too many to remember.
Yes, good for me though. Running an organization called 6, it works well.
Yeah, and of course we're thinking about you, Louise, when we decided to these expansions, right?
Thank you.
You're welcome. So let me go through them really quickly and then share maybe 1 or 2 of my favorites. And then of course, as a cliffhanger, I do have at least a 7th expansion that we left out or that we maybe didn't think about at the time, but I'm actually publishing a new book quite soon on that one. So it'll be like the appendix, right? It'll be the second, another book. But so the 6 expansions are first and foremost time, that we need to think differently around the time horizon for which we innovate or for which we design. And the challenges we're facing as a planet and as societies clearly call for longer term thinking. And so one expansion is simply opening up that space and saying, what does long-term thinking mean? Who's looking into this around the world? How might you deploy scenarios and foresight? What about speculative design? We have an example from a hospital that's actually been built right around the corner here in Copenhagen on like, how do you plan for a future of healthcare without knowing exactly what that future will be like and still build a hospital to be ready for the future? So that's the first expansion. The second one we call proximity. And proximity is a bit of a strange word, but it could be replaced in a way by empathy, meaning because we talk about closeness and the feeling of closeness to something or someone. And this is also back to your point about, or you mentioned this, from human-centered to life-centered design, that who we design for, who's the user, who's the customer, who's the citizen, is something that we need to rethink at a time when we first and foremost need to include more of the human race in design work. I mean, we often forget one of the two. Well, there are many genders, but we're forgetting women quite often in design. We're forgetting marginalized groups, ethnic groups. We're forgetting those that don't have much of a voice in society. We are also forgetting that we are nature ourselves, and when we design for people, we should also think about who else, or what other living things we could design for and with, bringing nature into our design, or reconsidering even the rights of certain living things. Then we have, speaking of which, we have a chapter on life, the expansion of life, opening up this whole space even more, and saying one thing is feeling of proximity, but who do we even, what do we consider living, and what do we not consider living? We have a world now where you can upload your digital self as an avatar, and it may very soon be able to take a life on its own, as we've seen in Black Mirror and similar series. We have a world where we are taking physical dead materials, like building materials, and infusing them with organic living organisms, so that, for example, a wall can repair itself. The boundaries are blurring. We also have some parts of the world, certainly, where lifespans are getting even further, and some are expecting the next generation of children to be able to grow to, let's say, 150. So we have life is being redefined, and we have to expand our thinking about life. Then we have a section on we call it dimensions, and by dimensions, it's really opening up the dialogue between people and machines, and technology and humans, and the interactions we have, and rethinking how we can be in the world with artificial intelligence. And in the book, there's a whole lot of reflection on technological determinism and the visions we're getting from Silicon Valley and the west coast of the US, that our technological future is determined, and we just get, we'll have more iPhones, we'll have more VR, more AI, and one day we'll hit the singularity, and then the machines will be smarter than us, and who knows what will happen. And we are rejecting that view and saying that people need to drive technology, and we can be partners with technology. And that's a huge and interesting space in the digital domain there and in those dimensions. Mm-hmm. Then we have a section on expanding value. And by value, we say, well, what is valuable, and what do we define as valuable? And basically, I mean, this is for this audience probably obvious, but we cannot keep measuring things only in financial value. We need to broaden it to looking at impact of innovation and design, including environmental, climate, bio impacts, social impact, and so on. So expanding value and designing with that in mind is of course key. And then finally, we have I think a chapter that in many ways speaks to your organization and to the whole idea of social innovation, namely sectors, and expanding sectors and reminding ourselves how sectors are blurring and changing between public and private and civic. And in a way, it's maybe less that they're expanding, but maybe more they're imploding, meaning that government is taking on roles of innovation and change in new ways, maybe especially on the back of the financial crisis and the need for government to be more proactive. And we have someone like Mariana Mazzucato saying governments actually are key in innovation. And we see private companies realizing that they cannot just pursue profits, but actually need to be doing good for society. So in a way, it's like shifting things around. And now the private sector is trying to do good and public sector is innovating. I mean, what's up with that? So things are blurring, and we need sectors to then, network and connect in new ways as we innovate. So those are the 6 expansions. And my favorites?
Your favorite.
Well, very briefly, proximity is about a feeling of closeness to something or someone that enables us to act ethically, is what we say in the book. An ethical action, meaning doing what's right, doing what's needed, more than what we're just told to do or what regulation tells us to do, I think is pretty key. And also in my own research, when I did my doctoral thesis in design and government, I could see that where true deep transformation really started to happen was when there was a feeling of empathy with citizens, with the situations that people were facing. And that empathy became a driver for leaders to transform what they were doing with their teams. And so it's a very powerful force. So I think that's certainly one of my favorites. And another favorite is maybe time, because we have a world that's so accelerated and at such high speed that slowing down time and allowing ourselves to imagine longer term futures is really key to any deeper transformation.
Yeah, I think the proximity one is very interesting, I think, for us and the kind of work that we're doing. And one of the previous conversation we had with Ezio Manzini on his book, which has got proximity in the title, but he very much talks about it in the way you're talking about it here in this conversation around the kind of empathy and the closeness and what physical proximity can do to people, and the rise of the 15-minute city and all of those things. But the other thing that I think was interesting that you talk about in your book is you talk about proximity to the environment and to living things and how that changes. And that's a different kind of way of talking about proximity, I think.
Yeah, it's more of the feeling of proximity rather than it's a physical one. And we of course also recognize that today you can be, I mean, you and I are proximate right now, even though there's a few thousand kilometers between us. And we are also arguing that to drive ethical action, you have to have that emotional connection with someone or something. And if we in design and innovation work can enhance that feeling of closeness, the experience that this matters, and there's something at stake for someone or something, then the likelihood that we'll actually really engage ourselves in innovation, that we'll actually rethink things, that we'll take action first and foremost, is higher.
So the big question is what you left out. What didn't make it in, and what's the next book on?
So in parallel, so this book did take a while to write and publish, and so maybe all in all, maybe a 3-year period. And during that period, at the Danish Design Center, we experimented with new forms of work organization, with how to reinvent ourselves as an organization and introduce self-management and abolish mid-level managers and well, not the people, but the roles, the functions, and really become a self-managing organization. And for me, that's in a way the seventh expansion, because we need at this point in human history to also rethink how we organize and how we collaborate, and how are we sustainable as organizations, and how can we be more sustainable humanly as organizations as we seek to be to create sustainable impact for the world. So you cannot have a toxic, hierarchical, bureaucratic, dysfunctional work environment and still hope to do good in the world. I mean, that's maybe for a short time you can do something. You've seen also in Silicon Valley some of the very brutal management methods of some of the innovators. They can get pretty far, but then there's a limit to how far they get, because suddenly things fall apart. Look at what's going on with Twitter right now, for example. So we are fascinated. I'm fascinated by new forms of work organization, and we've pioneered that ourselves, and we've described that quite clearly. And I think for design and designers, and now that's of course also my role, to say that there's a design job there, and there's a role for creativity, there's a role for sensibility, there's a role for empathy, there's a role for playfulness in reimagining the future organization and helping people get there. So that's in a way what we're also starting to do here, and that's what I would say could be in the next edition of the book. But in the meantime, with a colleague, I'm writing the book on creating meaningful, sustainable organizations by design, and that will be published next year in Danish at first, but hopefully also in English.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for letting us into that a little bit. Read Expand first, and then
right. Then the follow-up will be.
And then the next bit's coming up. Okay, good. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to come to those in a second, because actually I just want to just kind of switch about how we might apply some of these expanded thinking, expanded ways of thinking and doing onto some of the crises, I guess, the kind of crisis state that we're in Europe, from climate to also, migration and everything else that's come out of the war in Ukraine, and just the general state of how we're feeling in a society, the kind of grand challenges, and I'll come to that question in a minute. How, just thinking about some of those very practical issues,
right?
Healthcare, getting young people into work, etc., mental health crisis. How do we apply some of these things? And can you give an example of how you started to apply them as well with other organizations?
Yeah. So first and foremost, I mean, this, of course, in a way is a book about thinking. And we are arguing that if you don't think differently, you can act differently. And we're also arguing that first, once you have an idea, then, that doesn't go away. So we're hoping that by bringing new ideas and new thinking and expansive thinking to people, that's a starting point for something significant. Now, how do you then take those modes of thinking into practice? And on the one side, there's an appendix to the book where you can just look at a very easy overview of saying, okay, expansive thinking around time would mean going from this, going to that. It might mean you could ask these questions. So we have some prompts you can ask yourself as you're going through a process. So there's a resource there in the book that you just open up in the back of the book, and then you can take a look. But more importantly, I think from a design perspective, you could ask yourself, like, in what kind of process would I use this? And I think, very simply put, that there are three ways to apply the book. One is to challenge your assumptions. If you're looking at a problem or looking at maybe an opportunity in the context perhaps of some of these huge crises we're facing, use the book to say, okay, what will this look like in a longer time horizon? Or who are we actually, who do we need to care for here? Who do we need to be proximate to? Or what are the different sectors doing or not doing here, and how do they intermesh, and what would happen if they crossed in different ways? So you can use it to kind of challenge your assumptions, like what if. The second one is to use the expansions as like creative fuel and to drive your ideas, to get new ideas. And we've done that. We created a tool from the book, and then we used it for a group of business leaders here, actually from a German company that were visiting us. And put it this way, they got a lot of ideas. They got very, very, very many ideas, because by each of the expansions, they could use it to generate suggestions to the problem they're looking at. Actually, they called us up a week later after the visit and said, okay, we have all these ideas. How do we get them, how do we narrow them down again? I mean, how do we converge and make choices? Because it's too much. And of course, that's a luxury problem when you're trying to solve something, to have too many ideas. But of course, we could help them a little bit with that. And then the last point is, speaking of narrowing down, that if you have an idea, if you have a prototype, you have a suggestion, you have something you want to do, you could test it up against the 6 expansions, right? So how would this work in a longer time horizon? Or how would this work for other users than the ones we have in mind? Or how would this work if it was in a digital or virtual space, and so on and so on. So 3 ways, challenging assumptions, generating new ideas, and then using it as a way to test your prototypes.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's wonderful. And then there's a question actually in the chat that kind of relates to this, which is, are there any areas where we should be retreating rather than expanding?
Right. Yeah, retreating or converging, you could say. That's a really good question. I think that from my perspective, and of course from the perspective of the book, the challenge is that we're not seeing the world whole enough. We're not seeing enough of the world. We're not considering enough facets. We risk to, in a time of crisis especially, to have a very narrow focus and to manage risk and to solve problems in the here and now. And so I think there's a bigger risk of taking a too narrow view than of taking a too expansive or too broad view. But of course, you also risk losing momentum or direction, and you risk being in limbo for too long if you stay in the expansive mode, if you stay in a divergent mode too long. So you do have a point with the question that we also need to be concrete. We need to focus. We need to make something also tangible happen in the near future. And so, of course, that's the beauty of design and prototyping and concrete experimentation, that you can do that. And I think in the book, there are quite a few cases that exemplify expansive thinking through action, through concrete things that you can do. But currently, in a way, I feel that it's like the saying, "Don't panic." In the way the book says, don't panic, step back and take a broader look at what we're doing, take a more systemic perspective on things rather than just panicking and doing things here and now.
I like that. You started to talk about this, so let's kind of work towards the future and where you see this stuff going. Because obviously design is a future-oriented kind of way of working in the world. I'm going to ask you a question first, actually, that Alexander Van Vliet asked in the chat, which is about your reflections on the global nature of the grand challenges of the century and our current system, particularly of nation states. And he says, it seems to me that countries are wrong sized for the challenge, too big to make decisions on the human scale, too small to act against problems like climate change. His question is, can Denmark stay Denmark in the next century? And you have you rephrase the Fukuyama chapter in the book, which says not only how do we get to Denmark, but how do we get beyond Denmark? And so these questions are kind of connected. So yeah, what's your perspective on that?
No, I like it very much. It's a really good question. And also getting beyond Denmark, of course, is in a way what we try to do at the DDC, because we have to keep, going to the next evolutionary place. Whether nation states are wrong-sized or not the right design for the challenges we face, I think in many ways, yes. I mean, if you look at the pandemic, what happened was everybody went local, and I mean, Denmark, we shut our border to Sweden, which is like, I mean, last time that happened, of course, that was also a problem, was during the migration crisis in 2015. And we're thinking that, I mean, why are we doing that? Why are we making that kind of decision? It's because of the sense that we can protect our own people against the other people. And suddenly, from trading with each other and getting married to each other, and then suddenly they're the enemy almost, right? And so I think everybody reacted that way. I mean, pretty much any region, and in the United States, it was even the states that reacted that way, of creating regional rules. And in many ways, I think that of course you can say that's maybe damage control, but it also limits us in finding better solutions and in finding faster ways forward and in collaborating in new ways. So this knee-jerk reaction was, I think, pretty scary, and also it's of course incredibly scary what's going on with nation states, also invoking nation states and invoking some kind of national identity in what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah. So I think, and I've personally always been, quite engaged with the European vision. So finding ways to address challenges at that level, and I think we see that with Ukraine as well, that the response from EU has been actually quite, from my side, I think it's been positive, the way that there's been a response, and the new collective decision making that's actually been quite strong. But so I think, unfortunately, in a way, we will be having nation states for quite a long time going forward. But I think there's an underlying question, both on at what level to solve problems, but also a democratic question, which we do address a little bit in the book, on the relationship between elites and citizens, and new modes of co-design and collaboration, where I think there's a huge space also to expand how we even think about democracy and collective decision making.
Yeah, I really like that, particularly because I'm sitting in the UK, which made its own ridiculous choice. But at the same time, I'm also sitting in London, which is a complete bubble to the rest of the UK, and so it's so interesting seeing these two different things working together. And someone else actually asked a question about applying these things professionally, and I think I know what you're going to say. But their question was: is it for countries and contexts that have a long culture of change making, like Denmark, and can other people do this? And many other people will be on the call from very different types of countries.
Yeah. But it's certainly written for everyone. It's written not from saying this is what Denmark does. It's full of examples from around the world, from Asia, from the US, from Africa. We have a pretty big argument that innovation can happen anywhere, and we also have to expand our geographic focus on where can we learn from other cultures. So in that way, it's a very global perspective. And with that respect for different cultures, I mean, my colleague Jens Martin, my co-author Jens Martin, has worked extensively also in Africa. Actually, he founded the biggest design, innovation, entrepreneurship magazine in Africa called Ogoji. So he's very sensitive to that as well. And so I think what we are hoping is these are universal principles. These are universal principles that all of humanity can really take and use to address the challenges they see in their context.
I think that's absolutely right. And from the perspective of an organization like Six and the work that we're doing globally, you see people using these kind of methods and tools and principles and ways of thinking everywhere in the world, particularly in Asia, Southeast Asia, but not necessarily calling it in the same way.
Sure.
Different language for it, but it's absolutely, I think, an approach that can be applied. And I think your framing is really, really helpful for us to have a bit of a conversation around it. I have a final couple of questions for you, Christian, about the future. Maybe my first one is how are you hopeful? How hopeful are you for the future? And my second one that's connected, you can answer them in any way you like, is, what you hope the world will look like in, 2030 is very popular kind of moment for us to be talking about now because of SDGs and all sorts of other targets, but also, a little bit longer down the line when your children are older and, in 10, 20, 30 years, like how would you like the world to look if these kind of principles are used and applied?
Well, on the one side, of course, I'm also seeing all the crises, and again, having worked, with innovation and change for at least a couple of decades by now, it's more than we've seen at the same time. I mean, it's a poly crisis, right? It's a lot at the same time, which also indicates that we're kind of at an inflection point. The DDC, we talk a lot about transitions, right? And I think transition design is, in a way, the discipline we're all kind of needing to embrace. So on the one side, I think in the short term, certainly there's reason to worry that things are difficult, and difficult for a lot of people. Also, not least because of inflation, energy crisis as well. But I think in the longer term, I'm an optimist. Absolutely, I'm an optimist in the sense that there's so many creative people, there's so many organizations like yours and others that are really connecting people, that are finding new and better ways of solving problems, that we do have a resilience. I think the crisis also shown the resilience of the European Union and the partnership across the Atlantic and partnerships with Asia, that we can do this. And we have a framework with the global goals. That framework will have to be redefined by 2030. I'm hopeful for my kids that they will have the same or more opportunities than I do. I think it'll be a different type of opportunity. I think there will be some things that will be very different 20 years from now in terms of how we travel, of what energy consumption we have, of what climate footprint we have, probably also of how we collaborate at a national level, which we'll see whether the nation states are that resilient. But I'm fundamentally an optimist, but I'm also aware that the time we live in right now is very critical. And whether my kids will have a better quality of life or more opportunities than I had is right now an open question. And it's our task, I think, also my generation's task, to make sure that it may be different opportunities, but they are meaningful and good and enable good lives.
Yeah. Well, on that note, Christian, I think we should wrap it up. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk a little bit more about Expand. I genuinely couldn't recommend it enough, and I think at times where it sometimes feels that we feel a little bit hopeless and what can we do, it's really nice to read about possibilities, but also how they've actually been applied and used in real life. So thank you for this contribution to the world and to all of our thinking, Christian. Such a pleasure to always talk to you.
Louise, thank you.
Thank you for your time. You can, Fia's going to put the link up. I think you can buy the book. I think we have a special discount for you.
Yes, we do.
And we'll send it around in the link after the chat. But for now, thank you, Christian. Such a pleasure, and we'll see you soon.
Take care. Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Pleasure.